welcome everybody to the 264th CG webinar that is going to focus on the new geopolitics of international higher education. And we've got an exciting array of people who are going to contribute to this webinar, and I'm going to leave Emma to introduce all the speakers. But first, some housekeeping points. If we have the slides. Please note, the first thing to note is that this seminar is being recorded. Now, you might find that we would like you to, when you want to ask a question, to put it in the chat function. And then as I'm chairing this session, I will select those people who would like to ask their questions. When you're invited to ask your question, please put on your cameras and introduce yourselves. Otherwise, please keep yourself muted throughout the rest of the webinar, and it's up to you whether or not you have your video on. You might find that the best way to view the webinar is through speaker view. So then you know that you're seeing the person in full who is contributing to the webinar. Okay, and just to say that the recording of the webinar will be posted tomorrow along with any other material like the overheads, etc. So Emma, over to you, and look forward to this really interesting webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Claire, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us either live today or watching the recording on YouTube. I'm Emma Sabzaliyeva. I work at UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education and have been also a research associate at York University in Canada. And presenting sort of briefly before we hand over to our two sets of speakers today on behalf of myself and Hannah Moskowitz, who's joining us in the room and is on our work on the new geopolitics of international higher education. If the topic sounds a little bit familiar, that's good. This is a continuation of the conversation that we started through this webinar format in June 2021. Work that, as mentioned, Hannah and I are leading together with a team of authors working on diverse contexts and themes within this broad framing of the new geopolitics of international higher education. We root the study of higher education in prevailing geopolitical currents to study how international higher education practices are shaping and being shaped by global political dynamics. So through this pair of seminars at CG and in a forthcoming special issue of Globalization, Societies and Education, we're making the case for examining both theoretically and empirically what we're calling the new geopolitics of international higher education. So as regards the special issue, you should expect to see a number of the articles kind of being published shortly, and the rest will be trickling in over the next few months. And then, as is the way with journals, will be collected together in an issue at some point during the year. So this is getting pretty exciting at this point. So what do we mean when we talk about the new geopolitics of international higher education? What are we trying to push forward here? So first, it's about building on previous studies that combine these two sort of big notions, one on geopolitics, the other to do with higher education studies. So if you kind of take a sweep through the literature, you can see that there have been more realist approaches to international relations and how that might play out in geopolitical terms. Soft power, diplomacy, knowledge diplomacy, those are some other concepts that have been used to understand these phenomena. Geography, migration, globalization broadly put, and decoloniality. So that's kind of the body of knowledge that we build upon. In our own theoretical work, we are building on a critical geopolitics lens, which I'm not going to elaborate on a lot now because we sort of sketched out in the last webinar how we're working on that approach. But just to identify sort of three ideas from that body that I think is useful to rephrase at this point. So the first is about moving beyond what Agnew calls the territorial trap. The second is about not moving beyond, but moving past a very Eurocentric, Western body of hegemonic ideas about how we think about the world, how we conceptualize the world. And the third is about scale. So it's on the one hand about scaling down to study and understand everyday practices and experience, but on the other hand, it's about scaling up to study the transnational. So conceptually, we're trying to develop a framework that relates to these different scales, but also thinks about actors and enablers that are involved in the inherent national global interplay that comes up when we are thinking about geopolitics. So that's a little bit of background. Today, we're really thrilled to be able to welcome two of our teams of authors who've been working with us on the special issue. I'm going to hand over immediately after this to Carolina Guzman Valenzuela, who is a professor at the Universidad de Tarapacá in Chile. And Carolina is going to present her work. The paper is called New and Old Forms of Colonialism, Critical Border Thinking in Latin American Universities. And in the paper, Carolina examines scholarly work on old forms of colonialism based on a matrix of race and labor divisions, and new forms of colonialism attached to prestige and international rankings. And in the paper, she shows that Latin American universities have developed both inward and outward mechanisms based on critical border thinking, which she'll expand upon in the paper, and these mitigate the colonial forces. The second presentation will be by Lakshmi Bose and Lakshmi's colleague G, who'll be discussing their work on the paper is called The Political Imaginaries of Higher Education in Syria, Turkey and Their Borderlands. Lakshmi and G are based at the University of Cambridge, across the way from you guys. And their paper relates three seemingly disparate political moments at universities in Syria, Turkey and their borderlands to ask how geopolitical shifts related to regional conflict and authoritarianism both shape and are shaped by higher education. So we're delighted that they can be here with us today, bring forward this body of work. I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Carolina. Look forward to the presentations and then to the questions and answers afterwards.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much to the Center for Higher Education Studies for organizing this seminar, and Hannah and Emma for editing this special issue about internationalization and higher education. So in my paper, I argue that Latin American universities are currently and have been shaped by all new forms of colonialism that act concurrently. So on the one hand, universities have inherited, reproduced, and reinforced a matrix of power based on labor and race divisions. And on the other hand, Latin American universities have been subject to global forces that draw on the idea of world-class university that is attached to research productivity, prestige, and competition. So in my paper, I argue that a set of colonial forces coming from the past, expanding in the present, and projecting into the future poses serious challenges for universities, not only in Latin America, but also in peripheral countries. However, there is some hope and optimism because there is a radical change and transformation are possible in the periphery. And so I use the concept of border thinking. So sorry, I forgot about my PPT. So there are different schools of thoughts that analyze colonial and colonization processes. One of them is the colonial studies. Colonization processes have involved the conquest of lands, the exploitation of assets, resources, peoples, and their minds. This is not only about conquering lands and bodies, but also about imposing a culture, a way of seeing the world, language, education, religion, and so on. I use decolonial studies because they were born in Latin America. The decolonial studies are similar to post-colonial studies. There are some differences. I cannot go into details right now, but basically in the view of decolonial studies, modernity is an historical process that is often located in Europe. However, according to decolonial studies, modernity needs to be seen and understood under the lenses of colonialism in the Americas in the 15th century. So it's like two sides of the same coin. The Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano coined the concept of coloniality, which is a fusion of two words, colonialism and modernity. And basically, what he says, or he states, is that since colonial times, a matrix of power was imposed in the Americas, and this matrix of power draws on race and labor divisions. So basically, and very simply put into words, the white conquerors were superior, and their languages and the ways of seeing the world and their values were superior, while the indigenous knowledges, the indigenous peoples, their languages, and so on, were inferior. But of course, this is related to labor divisions as well, because the indigenous people got either they were semi-slaves, while the European white conquerors were the wealthiest peoples in the Americas. And what is interesting about Aníbal Quijano is that he proposed that this matrix of power was later exported to other regions of the world and generated a model of colonialism, and it was established in other colonies in Australia, in Africa, and Asia by several European countries. And to some extent, this matrix of power has prevailed and has been shaping identities, subjectivities, and narratives. In her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza, the researcher Ansaldúa refers to the exploitation of lands, the torture of indigenous peoples living in colonized countries and territories, and many other signs of colonialism and oppression. In short, bodies and lands are the objects of oppression and exploitation, and they can be considered as being subject to being wounded. These wounded and oppressed lands and bodies constitute spaces where radical and contesting actions and narratives are imagined and materialized. So I'm using Ansaldúa work and Mignolo work to connect this idea of oppression, but at the same time, spaces for resistance and transformation. So, and I connect all of this to the concept of border thinking. In Latin America, there is a long tradition of all forms of colonialism. During colonial times, universities were spaces to educate the elite. The Salamanca model was the most important model until 19th century. It's inspired by the Universidad de Salamanca, the oldest university in Spain. And after that, the Napoleonic idea of university focus on professional education prevailed. So as you can see, these two European ideas or models of universities that are heavily focused on teaching are the most typical type of university in Latin America. Universities are usually devoted to the teaching task. And so research is gaining some traction, I would say, over the last 20 years, more or less. In the 80s, Latin America experienced processes of massification, and these processes allowed the access of people from underrepresented backgrounds, for example, indigenous peoples. However, inequalities persist. just an example, studies indicate that indigenous students tend to be recruited by less selective and prestigious universities in Latin America, so they enter in the labor market at a lower level and so are remunerated also at a lower level. Regarding new forms or new ways of colonialism, I'm not going to provide a lot of details because I'm sure you are quite familiar with the idea of international rankings and the promotion of the idea of world-class university, the importance of gaining power, prestige. And as you know, the most prestigious universities are in wealthy countries such as the USA, the UK, and Australia, while Latin America doesn't have any university within the 100 highest positions. What is important here for my paper is highlighting the idea that to some extent, Latin American universities have been importing an idea of university that is dependent on the Western academia. And this idea of world-class university is an hegemonic narrative that has been imposed upon universities and academics here in the global south in Latin America. So basically what I did was analyzing the scholarship or the knowledge production about colonialism and internationalization as a response to this special issue. And I identify the main patterns of publications contained in 3 well-known indexes, Web of Science and Scopus, and Cielo is very popular in Latin America. And then I identify the main challenges, identifying in these articles regarding colonialism and the ways in which universities cope with these tensions, because this is a tension. And the sample is composed of 124 papers, and the most what I'm going to focus on right now is the thematic analysis of 24 papers, which is, I think, is the richest analysis. Well, here you can see more or less the production is very modest. It's very modest. There aren't very many papers. Most of them are published in Spanish, in Cielo. But as I said, to me, the most interesting and rich part is the thematic analysis. So basically, in analyzing the 24 papers published in 2019 by at least one Latin American author, I distinguish between all forms of colonialism that deal with discrimination toward indigenous peoples, and also new forms of colonialism that are related to this idea of global trends in higher education and internationalization. So I identify different initiatives or reflections that appear in these papers that can be part of this concept of border thinking. And basically, I distinguish between local mechanisms and global mechanisms. Local mechanisms are those related to indigenous people. So, for example, some papers focus on affirmative actions and the ways in which indigenous people access university. Some papers reflect on their journeys and the struggles they experience when they are in the university and the way they are discriminated in the university. And some other experiences which are very interesting are those related to empowering indigenous students and local communities so as to produce a transformation beyond the university. So through these initiatives, the universities work closely with the indigenous communities in trying to keep ancestral knowledges, for example, and promote a model of sustainable development. And the idea here is offering a voice to indigenous people through action research projects that provide leadership roles to those peoples. Then the global mechanisms are I would call them reflective pieces or reflective papers that are quite critical about international rankings, the ways in which English, for example, is the main language to publish, and the ways in which this condition and shape the Latin American university and the academia. And for example, just one example, I pick up the concept of peripheral science, which I think is interesting in the sense that Latin American universities have the responsibility to put into dialogue Western and non-Western knowledges, for example, through the curriculum or in research projects. And some other papers reflect on the marketization of the university. So to conclude, I don't know how I'm doing with time, but to conclude, I identify a double discrimination. Yeah. On the one hand, an inherited discriminatory pattern that has been reproduced and reinforced by universities and within universities in Latin America. So what I am saying in my paper is that Latin American universities have been not only inherited by reproducing a matrix of power based on labor and race divisions. It is true that there are many initiatives to deal with this discrimination, but there is a lot of work to do. And on the other hand, a discriminating situation arising from processes of exportation and importation of imaginaries about elite world-class universities. And again, here, Latin American universities have a kind of ambivalent position. There are a lot of criticisms against international rankings, but at the same time, they are seen as a means to be part of this global idea of higher education and being part of this group of prestigious universities, something that we will never reach, I think. Just to finalize, the idea of border thinking and agency for Latin American universities. As I said, there is a lot of criticisms and pessimisms, but at the same time, spaces for hope to promote transformation and create new spaces to think about the university. In my paper, I mentioned that I was able to identify a lot of concrete mechanisms to deal with discrimination of indigenous peoples. And that is great, and we can continue in that way. However, I think that there is much more to do regarding global trends in higher education and international rankings and the ways in which Latin American universities are going to position regarding these hegemonic narratives about higher education. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's great. So in the next 25 minutes, if we can keep things short, that would be fantastic, so that everybody has a chance to talk. So over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just gonna share our presentation, and Lakshmi, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Just give me 1 second to adjust my screen.
Joys of technology.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for having us. So we'll try and be as brief as possible. So today, G and I are going to present work on a paper that we're currently working on that's trying to understand shifts in higher education in authoritarian contexts. So this paper is about higher education and authoritarianism across 3 different case studies that derive from our respective PhD projects. So G looks at Syria, myself I look at Turkey, and then G undertook additional digital research just for this paper, looking at the borderlands between Syria and Turkey. And so what we're trying to do is bring these 3 cases together relationally to comprehend different aspects of higher education imaginaries in authoritarian contexts of varying intensities, mediated by local, national, and transnational forces. So our aim in this relational approach is to move beyond methodological nationalism and often instrumentalist perspectives of higher education and conflict. So a lot of the literature necessarily on higher education and conflict speaks about higher education as used by regimes to enact state building aims or coercive control. And so what we're hoping to do here is shed light on how these shifts, these authoritarian attacks, are negotiated and re-articulated in new and revised imaginaries of higher education in the lived reality of higher education's actors. So we have two questions that we bridge together, it's fine, that we've tried to guide bringing these three cases together. So the first one is, how are higher education imaginaries shifting in response to authoritarian attacks on higher education? And the second one is, how does examining shifting higher education imaginaries in authoritarian conditions yield additional perspectives on the state? And just to give you a quick overview of this presentation, we're really at the moment trying to work our theory with the cases, knowing the limits of bringing two very different studies together. So we're just going to give an extended overview of the theory and present Turkey more explicitly. And then hopefully that'll give space for feedback and comments. So firstly, with the limitations, as this came from two different PhD projects, we have extremely divergent methodologies. Turkey was ethnographic, and G's work was done as digital research. So it's not a comparison in any means, it's very different types of data, but we're hoping that this allows us to capture different aspects of the phenomena that leads to an interesting discussion about different intensities and meaning, while at the same time speaking to the realities of securitized research today in authoritarian context. Speaking of surveillance and security, that of course affects the sample size and access, as all three sites are increasingly covered by high degrees of state surveillance as well as private surveillance, and participants can be charged for treason and other, even as a terrorist, for speaking with foreign researchers. So obviously all of those factors mitigate who you can speak to in the beginning. And the last point also for future research is we're quite limited in scope. The inclusion of Rojava itself, we feel, would be a huge asset to this conversation. We don't have the scope in either of our research to discuss it, but we are aware that this is something that would yield additional points to what we're trying to convey. So I'll pass over to G now for the theory.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Yeah, so why a social imaginaries or political imaginaries framing? The idea of the imaginary is called upon in so many different kinds of work and approaches that it can feel not only ambiguous, but at times hollow. And so part of the paper is an attempt to kind of stabilize and clarify what we mean, and also to address a gap in the literature, in the imaginaries literature, that doesn't often call upon or name authoritarian context or conditions as an imaginary in and of itself. And we kind of set off to wonder why exactly that is, and if there's room for these kinds of cases to be included. Of course, Charles Taylor's work on imaginaries is critical to this debate. Taylor defines imaginaries as the quotidian and co-constructed ways in which groups of people imagine their social worlds and their relationships to it. This includes a kind of shared pre-reflexive understanding of history, place, and practice. It's in this way similar, of course, to Bourdieu's habitus and to Heidegger and Wittgenstein's background. But Taylor's imaginaries are unique in that they are articulated and expressed in symbolic fields. He goes as far as to say that these symbolic fields are not necessarily just frames or lenses through which we interpret reality, but they are constitutive of reality itself. So in this way, there is no outside to Taylor's imaginary, and we all exist in and through a plurality of them. That was significant at the time during especially the debates around multiple modernities, because there has been this long-standing Western bias in philosophical debate about the sociality of human imagination. And while we acknowledge and appreciate Taylor's kind of counter to that Eurocentrism, we also feel that there are gaps that were not overcome. We identify three in the paper and attempt to work with them, and they include the absence of power relations in Taylor's work, an ambiguous relationship between belief, ideology, and the imaginary. And the third one is around ideas of legitimacy and morality. So in this light, the question of authoritarian coercion that Lakshmi touched on in the opening is a really interesting and illuminating one. So Taylor claims that imaginaries are these kinds of background knowledges that quote unquote are prototypically based in belief, end quote. So they're this kind of symbolic superstructure that is said to reflect a society's moral order and that confers legitimacy on cultural forms, practices, and institutions. And that definition as the real kind of essence or kernel of the imaginary becomes really difficult and appears to lack utility if we think about political contexts where in fact, structures of domination and political control are not won by indoctrination or belief, but rather, as someone like Lisa Wadeen might argue about pre-revolutionary Syria, are won through unbelief and dissimulation. So we turn at this point to Manfred Steger and Paul James, who offer a kind of layered framework for thinking about imaginaries as deeply related to ideas, ideologies, and also ontologies. And their point here really is that ideology as a separate, but of course deeply related realm to the imaginary is the field of contest and also decontestation. That the aim of ideology or ideological projects is to naturalize truth claims to the point that they become latent background knowledge. This gets us a step in the right direction, but it doesn't take us far enough. And the claim that we're trying to work out in the paper is in fact, matrices based on consensus building to understand ideology are insufficient if we want to think critically about authoritarianism. So what we offer instead is an idea that while yes, decontestation may represent consensus, indoctrination, agreement, it can also, ideological decontestation or the naturalization of ideological claims can also represent or reflect resignation or acquiescence. Either way, dominant ideologies, whether backstopped by persuasion or violence, can color our deepest held understandings of the world and its potentials. And so we make this claim that people may bend towards ideology without bowing to it fully. But either way, this shift in stature changes the subject's gaze in fundamental ways. If held long enough, whether out of desire or fear, it may also reshape basic understandings of self and other, of action and judgment, of expectation and practice. I'm going to skip over the rest of the section. We also bring in Isaac Kamola and Aletta Norvella's work on apartheid as an imaginary rather than an ideology. And we end up working with Sharon Stein and Vanessa Andreotta, who talk about, and this relates very much to the first presentation, where the global matrix, the colonial matrix of power lives, and the way in which dominant imaginaries are themselves dominating. And in fact, in contradistinction to Taylor's work, there isn't an absence of power in imaginaries, but in fact, they are a technology of power themselves. So I'll leave it there. I think I won't say anything about the Syria cases, and I'll just hand it to you, Lakshmi, for Turkey.
Okay, thanks. So moving on to Turkey, I'll just give you a brief historical context. So I'm going to be speaking out Boğaziçi University, which was formerly Robert College, an American secondary school. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in 1971, it officially became Boğaziçi, and it inherited this liberal tradition from Robert College as a public institution, which lay in contrast to a lot of the universities that sat at the crux of some of the heated political discussions in Turkey at the time. Now, what's important for this conversation is the horizontal transparent system of governance that Boğaziçi inherited and sought to produce over the next few decades. So it was about the direction and management of the university as it was done by students and academics. So after conducting interviews with academics from 3 generations of Boğaziçi, the point that they made that, of course, there was political contestation, there was Kemalism, more liberal strands, etc. But the point was they had a commitment to agonistic decision-making within the university, separate from the state. So in 1980, however, there was a coup in Turkey, and then YÖK was established, which is the Higher Education Council, to tame the universities. So in 1980, a centralized council was formed and a rector was appointed in Boğaziçi. However, As the authoritarian trends from the coup diminished across the 80s, Boğaziçi regained its sort of autonomous status and tried to rebuild these cultures of a sort of democratic, agonistic, political university that was separate from a regime or state. And then next slide, please. Thanks. So since 2013 Gezi Park resistance and then the 2016 attempted coup, Turkey has moved more and more towards authoritarian politics, with a huge emphasis on controlling a lot of the historically political universities. However, until 2021, most of the control was directed, for example, at Istanbul University or Middle East Technical University, and Boğaziçi managed to maintain what students would call, it was a safe space in Istanbul, a landscape of authoritarian control, particularly after the state of emergency. However, January 1st, 2021, Erdogan appointed a rector for the first time since 1980. Immediately following this, there were huge resistance from both faculty and students alike, public protests. And the students had a lot of creative demonstrations, concerts, videos, strategic social media campaigns, and this has been going on for the last year. They were met with the police siege, campus securitization, and crackdown. Next slide, please. Perfect. So that's a photo of a daily protest that the academics do every day. They stand in front of the rector's office and they turn their backs to it, demonstrating their disapproval and refusal to operate under a regime-appointed rector. So in spite of the arrests and the state violence, these protests are continuing. And so what they say is important about these protests is the widespread support of the faculty. That often when they say you look at academic protests, it's a small section, but it's almost the entire Boğaziçi faculty that has been engaged in these daily protests for a year. And they're saying what this does is this moves Boğaziçi as an institution of power itself. So their collective action makes Boğaziçi different itself. And it comes from a different imaginary that sits against what Erdogan is trying to promote as the purpose of higher education in modern authoritarian Turkey. And this is that Boğaziçi is a public thing. And it sits as a different higher education against, for example, the imaginary of Istanbul University. And it is supposed to be a particular type of politics, not based on violence conflict, which is often the case in other universities, but on a sort of liberal type of agonism from a long history, almost half a century of attempted agonism. So the point isn't that Boğaziçi is a perfect democracy or it's utopian at all, but it's that they have a collective intent to achieve a space of agonism in politics in which multiple perspectives and ideologies are given space for expression. And then next slide, please. So what they've done is they've tried to make this an international resistance, and a huge strategy of the academics has been to call out to transnational actors. So whether that be, for example, Judith Butler or other higher education universities around the world and other governments. And so what they're trying to do is craft a higher education imaginary of liberal, autonomous higher education that sits apart from the state. So what they're doing in response to this authoritarian crackdown is something new, in which essentially higher education sits as a free liberal space apart from the state. So liberalism in this particular case and those values and morality attached to it is distinct from liberalism as a state. So then what they're creating is essentially islands of freedom connected to other islands of potential cosmopolitan freedom and notions of liberalism, trying to give their argument validity. So the geopolitical weight of their actions aren't about their national container, but it comes from the symbolic value of their public thingness, which departs from other notions of higher education as an instrumentalist device. So what we kind of want to ask, looking at this particular case, is what can higher education institutions be as a geopolitical player, even within authoritarian landscapes? And then I'm just going to pass it over to G for a couple last thoughts.
I think we've run out of time. There's so much to say, and the data on Syria points in very, very different directions because, of course, the limitations of freedom of expression and violence are so extremely different. But hopefully there's enough there to have a discussion. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks to all speakers. I mean, it just shows how limited the webinar format is, because I think, we've really got 3 substantial papers there, and each of them, and they're different, each of them deserves a really significant reflection and discussion. And thanks very much, Emma, for organising this such strong presentations, and it'll repay revisiting on YouTube. But I think, in the case, of all the papers, I think we'd all like to get more access to your work. I've got a very quick starting question. We are waiting for questions to come into the Q&A. Colleagues, do bring them forward now. But I've got a quick starting question, one for Carolina. The other one, I think, for Lakshmi. Carolina, I mean, at the base of the rankings and the tyranny of the rankings and the neocolonialism of the rankings, there's the bibliometric world. And the bibliometrics define what legitimate knowledge is, what high status knowledge is, and often what knowledge is at all. And it's changing bibliometrics, it seems to me, is one of the issues which we all face. And those of us in the global north, inverted commas, maybe have opportunities here to make a difference if we can start to develop momentum for opening up the bibliometric collections to other languages, to a broader set of disciplines in a more nuanced way, to Indigenous knowledge and so on. Now, my sense is that that may be possible. It may be possible to make advances there. The question is how. What we're talking about, I think, is, the bibliometricians themselves, Scopus, Elsevier, and Web of Science, and also the science communities, the leaders in the disciplines, if you like. And we're probably talking about the strong universities that legitimate it all as well. I suspect that if one university like my own went out hard on opening up the bibliometrics, it would simply be isolated within the elite system. But if a group of the elite universities were to take this up, we might be able to make progress. I think there needs to be a bottom-up movement and a top-down movement, if you like, to try to open things up. I mean, what do you think about the strategy of that? And for Lakshmi, I mean, there was tremendous repression in the Turkish universities. Lots of people were imprisoned. Lots of people pushed out of lost their jobs and so on. What was the impact of that wave of marginalisation and repression of not only activists but lots of professionals operating in their context? I mean, what difference did that make at the time? Carolina.
Thank you, Simon, for your question. I agree with you. I think that bibliometric analysis highlights sometimes of types of knowledges while making visible other kind of knowledges. I think that Latin American universities have made an incredible effort in trying to make visible their knowledge production, especially in the social sciences and humanities, through Cielo. I think that although Cielo doesn't have the prestige that Web of Science or Scopus have, Cielo works under a non-commercial basis and is financed by many public universities across Latin America. So it's free, and there isn't any kind of commercial basis there. However, the system is not perfect, as we know, and there are many delays and many other issues, because basically there is a group of public universities producing public knowledge. And I think that that is a model that is a bit obsolete, but not in a negative sense, in the sense that what prevails is a commercial idea of knowledge production rather than the idea that Cielo has been trying to push. And I think that that is a good alternative, and it opens spaces for knowledge as a public good. And I think it's important, and this is why bibliometrics should include this different kind of indexes and not only Web of Science and Scopus. You're mute, Simon.
Lakshmi, thanks, Caroline. Lakshmi, the repression in Turkey, I mean, what impact did it have?
No, thank you for the question. I'll just give a brief answer and pass over to G, because actually their work speaks very directly to the repression. For Turkey, I very much saw it as a politics out of history, coming from academics who had already lost their jobs in the 80s and then were at threat again of losing their jobs some 30, 40 years later. So a lot of it was discussions over whether they should adopt a Kemalist form of resistance, for example, waving the Turkish flags as a way to safeguard against excessive police violence and against the younger students' more radical trend, which was informed by more anarchist and feminist anti-state rhetoric. So it was often a balance between those two perspectives of revolution. And maybe G, you have something to add?
I mean, I would just say that the repression of academic space in regime-held Syria is deafening. It is a chokehold grip, and you're either a client of you're either a patron or client of the system, or you're not. What we do try to bring up in the paper, at least, though, is that there still are other value attachments and moral orders that survive. And we look in that case study about how a kind of authoritarian imaginary can coexist with educational imaginaries around mobility, social mobility and geographic mobility, and how universities end up functioning both as authoritarian enclosures, but also as escape routes. And of course, that second claim is limited in nature, as it doesn't relate to a lot of people, but it does nonetheless exist.
Thanks for that. Now we've got a number of people coming in. Jane Gatewood has the first question, but look, because of time, I might ask Ron Barnett to speak as well in this bracket. So let's take Jane's question first. Hello, Jane. Jane Gatewood.
Hi, Simon, and thanks, everyone. I'm curious what the speaker's position is on, or thoughts are on China in this space as a site of authoritarianism and as the originator of the global rankings, with the first ranking in 2003.
Thanks, Jane. And Ron Barnett.
I'm conscious of time, but had we had more time, I would have been interested in getting the researchers to talk to each other. There was mention of liberalism, and I wonder if there's a tension here between raising critical questions about Western liberalism on the one hand in a post-colonial perspective, but on the other hand, valuing Western liberalism amid over-tight state steering on the other hand. What are we to think of Western liberalism? Do we ditch it or do we embrace it?
Those two big questions, China and Western liberalism. So if you could sort those out for us, then we probably won't have to run any more webinars. Who would like to take them on?
Very complex questions. Regarding, well, I'm sure Simon knows much more than me about China and the role of and its role in international rankings, and at the same time being an authoritarian site, at least the academic or universities. What is interesting is, in my view, and this is just my view, is that they propose the international rankings, and that is a way of trying to emulate as well a model. So to some extent, in my view, this Western model of university is being emulated, and international rankings and the creation of the Argu rankings in China, for example, is a strategy, in my view, a means to emulate this Western way of conceiving the university. And by the way, China is performing very well in terms of productivity. And regarding Ron Barnett's question, I think there is a tension, but of course, I think that it depends on how we define Western liberalism. It's a huge concept, and I think that at least I can see a kind of ambivalence. There are criticisms against the Western liberalisms, but at the same time, there are some views that try to go in line with this Western liberalism. So there are ambivalent responses. And I don't think there is just one response, good or bad, or positive or negative, but ambivalent responses. Well, that's it.
G and Lakshmi, any thoughts to add?
I think there's an interesting relationship between the two questions. I mean, liberalism as a concept is used as cover for authoritarian political projects. America increasingly is a good example, and is also the seat of many of the institutions that produce these kind of epistemically repressive global ranking systems that the rest of the world then has very little choice to participate in. So I don't know, I think liberalism, I think our colleague is right to say that as a concept, it's almost too complicated to know what to do with other than to try to resist it.
All right, two more questions coming through. Lakshmi, do you want to say anything at this point?
I might give space for another couple of questions, then return if there's time.
I think that's the right thing to do, yeah. Now let's bring in Melis Sin and Elizabeth Buckner at this stage, who I think Elizabeth's following up on the previous discussion. And Melis is opening up some more comparisons about authoritarianism. So Melis is first.
Hello, everyone. This is Melis Anna from Lancaster University. So I thank you very much for the insightful, interesting presentations today. So it's been really helpful. My question is about on the concept of authoritarianism. The literature on authoritarianism is quite large, and we often see the comparison papers in Turkey and Hungary and Poland in relation to authoritarianism. But actually, what Turkey has a particular what distinguishes Turkey from the rest of the authoritarianism sort of literature is that it builds on the Islamic populism and the neoliberal authoritarianism, as opposed to what we see in Hungary and Poland. So we can argue that the religion has played a vital role in shaping some of the higher education landscape, as you would see in the case of CEU and how they shut down the gender departments and so on. So my question is in relation to how do you take authoritarianism in your research, and how does it build on this Islamic populism? And I also want to sort of understand how it aligns with the political imaginaries that you're talking in relation to higher education and governance in Turkey. Thank you so much.
And Elizabeth, good to have you in the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Lakshmi. And G, great presentation. I just want to make a simple point, because we're looking at the case of Boğaziçi too and know the case very well. One of the things that we're sort of finding is maybe its positioning as an elite university, all of the international connections, it's in English, a lot of their Twitter presence, and making these appeals to the global community on behalf of pluralism and whatnot. It's actually quite divided and cut off in some ways from other Turkish academics that have been, and so in some ways is it reflecting this tension that we see, but also maybe, yeah, so I'm just wondering if that nuances your argument a bit about sort of the potential of it being one of these islands of freedom.
Lakshmi, would you like to start?
Sure. Both great questions. Don't know if I can answer them at the time. But to the first one, I guess what I found interesting about the Islamic populism is that's in part also a backlash from a leftist, socialist, communist past that was often in place in the university. So I'd say the key example of the conflict that still exists and happens in different ways would be the Headscarf Conflict. So for example, if you looked at certain points in the 70s and 80s, headscarves weren't allowed in universities, even later at that point. And now you have Islamic populism that is pushing for a different idea of the space of femininity within the university and what the public space is, and according to religion. So in Turkey, there's constantly a shuttling back and forth over notions of morality, which often uses state feminism in different ways to get across motions of power concentrations in this case. And then of course, like Erdogan's policy coming from the urban ghettos, bringing that together into the university obviously brings a lot of class dynamics, which play out, bringing to Elizabeth's question, in, for example, Boğaziçi University. So often less spoken about is the differences between class dynamics within the resistance movements of the universities themselves. So Boğaziçi I found quite tricky, as other academics from other universities would call Boğaziçi an elitist institution, but academics in Boğaziçi would vehemently refute that claim, saying, no, it's a space of meritocracy. So of course you get to the limits of liberalism itself and the replication of a particular idea of state, which G has spoken about a lot, reproduces the very state and the conditions of authoritarianism that they're aiming to resist, which a lot of them are aware of in their own way, but a lot of them find that this is the only possible space of activism, that they don't know another way outside of liberalism to get their space of freedom. So, but it's something I would like to think about a lot as well, the limitations of islands of freedom. So thank you.
G and Carolina, I think we're getting towards the end, but we can run a little bit over 3 o'clock, and we do so.
Carolina, did you want to come in? I can say something about.
I don't have anything to add. I don't know whether there is another question.
I think this is the last. I think we're sort of wrapping up now.
I can just briefly say that I can appreciate, especially considering the popular use of the idea of imaginaries as inextricably linked to the imagination as productive, that the idea of evoking an authoritarian imaginary can feel quite dissonant. But if we delink the background, if we delink our latent knowledge about the world from our kind of value attachments or beliefs, then the background can in fact be a reflection of dominance and political order that we don't also believe in or feel deeply invested in. And that's what we mean by the potential for an authoritarian imaginary. And that is a really complicated topic that hopefully we will work out in the paper.
Carolina, you have the last word, I think.
No, to be honest, I think that there are too many complex concepts here. And I think that the idea of tensions or contradictions within a same imaginary deserves further explanations. I think that we cannot see things as black or white. So there are many ambivalent values and positions, and even contradictions when analyzing this kind of hegemonic narratives. So there is much more to do, but it's difficult to answer these difficult questions.
I'm continually struck by how difficult it is to move forward with politics at the moment, and there are so many constraints, and we're haunted by what we've inherited. I want to thank Emma Sabzaliyeva for coming forward with this excellent webinar, and to our 3 wonderful presenters. You are all very welcome back into the CG webinar program. And Emma, I just hope there's a new Geopolitics of International Higher Education Part 3. And I think you have a hand up. Did you want to say something?
Oh, Simon, I always have a hand up. I appreciate that we're over time, and I don't want to take away from some of the really important points that have been raised by the speakers. I did just want to note that on reflection, I sort of wish we had done this in 2 parts, because I think both presentations today really merited a lot more time, both for the presenters to talk and for the discussion. So let's see, Simon, whether that's something that we could do. I just kind of want to leave people with two of the ideas which are being put forward here. The one is about the very critical notion of borders, and I really think that we need to collectively work more on how we connect that into our understanding when we're in this frame of the new geopolitics of higher education. So this concept of borders, and the other, which Carolina puts forward, as double discrimination, but it comes up in G and Lakshmi's presentation as well. It's about the inherently sort of dualistic nature of some of the tensions that we're seeing, whether those are local, global, whether those are inside, outside the university, whether it's elite meritocracy, and how we deal with these as well, I think, is one of the other reasons why we're sort of perpetually reflecting on how we think about it and how we take it forward. So thank you for letting me just add in a couple of points there as we wrap up. But yeah, again, thank you everybody for coming today. Thanks to our presenters, and I'm going to say we'll do a part 3 if people would like one.
Thanks, Emma. And nice comments coming through in the chat. Dan likes the webinar. Christina De Cavallo agrees with you, Caroline, about Skilo. So there you are. Our next webinar in this program, which will be held next Tuesday, we return to the topic that we had earlier this week, students as global citizens, and our presenters will be Shi Tao and Stephanie Mitsuko Kukita. So we look forward to seeing you all then. We've had tremendous audiences this year in the webinars, and long may that continue because it gives us great discussion. And I do invite people to consider giving webinars themselves from their own work. We're in the process of putting together the 2022 program at the moment. Well, we've got a pretty full program up to about Easter. After that, we've got lots of spots on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so do keep that in mind. Do send in your proposals for webinar. You know, sometimes it's good to do it with someone else. Sometimes it's good to do it on your own. So either format works for us. I'll say bye for now. And once again, thanks to all the participants today. Great webinar. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.